be talking to Victor Wu from Yale Political Science. He's a PhD student writing about it's like fascinating foundational issues in politics. And Victor, I thought I would just start with a little bit about you and background, and we'll kind of work our way up to where you and I uh, got started on our conversation about the presidency and where you think legislative predominance comes from, and so on. But first, where do you come from? Can you just tell me a little bit about your interests in political science and how they got sparked?
Yeah, sure. So I grew up in Connecticut, Durham, Connecticut. It's like a small, historically farming town, about 7,000 people, like 30 minutes drive from New Haven. So my parents, they're immigrants from China, so they moved to the U.S. in 1991. Pretty much, they were the first wave of students out after June 1989. I was born in Pittsburgh, 1994. We moved to Durham when I was 4, and so I've grown up there ever since. Um, a little, like, very fun biographical tidbit we can talk about a little bit later is I eventually learned that I lived basically like a 5-minute walk away from James Scott's house, his farm in Durham. Yeah, so I went to high school at Xavier High School, like an all boys Catholic school in the area in Middletown. Then went to undergrad at Harvard. I fall of 2012, sorry. And I basically came in. I got interested in philosophy in high school via Catholic theology. Um, and so I kind of came in with two somewhat intention interests that I was trying to reconcile. So one of which was philosophy, and the second of which was like I wanted to be a famous startup founder. So I was super interested in high school reading pretty good Paul Graham's essays. I thought he was an amazing writer. I was really inspired, but he's the co-founder of Y Combinator and Sam Altman's mentor. And he was a philosophy major too. And a lot of people in this kind of space, like so Paul, Reid Hoffman, etc. They'd all studied philosophy and they had found it formative for one reason or another. Yeah, so that was kind of what I was interested in going in. Then I spent the first year of college mostly taking math and CS classes. But then I realized I like sucked at them, and also was not very interested in in either. So my parents, both of them moved to the U.S. to study chemistry, but both switched to CS. And my dad is a software engineer. My dad is a data scientist. My mom's a software engineer now. And my sister also studied CS in undergrad. So I'm the only non-CS person in the family. Yeah, so I basically got interested in political philosophy as a freshman in spring of 2013. I took it was a very, very random path. I took a freshman seminar with the biologist, Doug Milton, that was called Big Ideas. And so it's like every week, kind of learn like one big idea from a different field. And the week we did philosophy was the Rawls-Nozick debate. And so that was my first exposure to Rawls and Nozick. And then, but especially the little bits we read were like Rawls on natural lottery and Nozick on desert and entitlement. So I read that and was like, oh my God, this is like what I wanted to do all along. Like I had a strong interest in politics growing up, volunteered for like local state rep campaigns, things like that. Read the news very frequently. And so this seemed like, oh, this is like exactly the level of abstraction that I was interested in, debating principles, ethics, how we ought to structure our political, lives and institutions. So then I basically spent the next, especially the junior and senior year I was basically just immersed in contemporary moral and political philosophy. And so like, it's essentially like Rawls studies, right? Like it was I practically read like every debate, every move, every, major. Yeah. So that I was immersed in that. I found it really fascinating. So I planned to study, basically continue study at apply to philosophy PhD programs. I was going to work for a few years and then apply. So this was so I graduated in 2016 though, right? So this is so pretty much my entire adult life has been defined by it's in the shadow of Trump, right? So my senior year of college was just constantly discourse about Trump, about like the clash between rural and urban America, between liberal conservative America, between like real America and like the kind of coastal liberal elite bubbles, and so that had a big influence on me. And then around the same time, also in college, William Deresiewicz, whose essays I'd also read as a high school student, in 2014 published a book called Excellent Sheep. which is kind of like a critique of elite higher education, saying basically, students come in and basically just follow whatever career treadmill that they were put on to go to consulting or banking or now tech, right? So that had a big impact on me too. So I was kind of fishing around for like something to just do with my, get a life experience that was outside of that world, but also would put me in kind of contact with a kind of broader cross section of American society. I mean, growing up from Durham, obviously it's a small town, so it's relatively conservative. But certainly Cambridge, Massachusetts is the opposite. And so I basically stumbled on the military as an option. And so again, I can talk more about that, but I've already said enough just in response to that very first question. So
No, that's great. Don't worry, I'm not expecting to get the lion's share of the airtime here. So I wanted to ask while we're still, warming up about this James Scott connection. Could you tell me a bit more about that?
yeah, so I actually somehow had no idea who he was until after I graduated college
Oh,
in
hey,
20.
can we just tell it just to put it on the record? Like, who is James C. Scott?
Yeah, so he was a very famous political scientist, anthropologist, specialist in Southeast Asia, but his most famous work and one that I've seen any number of people like reference, cite, well outside political science is a book called "Seeing Like a State." And, it's the subtitle is something like "How Various Schemes to Improve the Human Condition Have Failed." Um, and so it's a sweep it, it's really like memorable opening talking about like forestry techniques from like in Germany in like the 19th century or something like that. But basically the argument is that the central the organizing metaphor is sight. It's like what does a state need to see? And so the kind of key concept that gets developed and extracted is legibility. And so the idea being that like states need to make reality into kind of uniform categories in order to see reality. And so it's a kind of critique of what he calls high modernism, basically various effort, of course, communism being the paradigmatic example, but it's far from the only one that he developed. And so Scott, he's an anarchist. He's like a kind of like anti-state, like left, intellectual, and kind of has been, his personal and political commitments are very closely tied with his scholarship in ways that don't detract from it, that actually, amplify and kind of complement it. But so I learned about Scott. He's also part of his formation, kind of his background is the fact that he studies agrarian societies, and he personally is he described himself as like a mediocre farmer, right? So he had a farm in Durham, which is historically a farming community. Um, and yeah, so I basically I learned who he was, and then also that he lived like 5 minutes away from me in 2017. So at a year after I graduated, and so I read Seeing Like a State and was blown away. And then I started Googling him, saw a New York Times article about him, and the location was Durham, Connecticut. So I was like, oh, I have to like reach out to this guy. So I just kind of cold emailed him and was like, hey, like I also live in your town and I love your book. Like, can we meet up? Um, and he's super super generous. So I remember the date because it was so January 4th, 2018. I went to his farm. This was the day before I left for Marine Officer Candidate School. I went to his farm, had coffee and cake, and he gave me a signed copy of a relatively new book at the time. He gave me a signed copy of it.
Hey.
Yeah, so I actually can show you and the funny thing is this is the first time we'd ever met. So he didn't really know me, and so he was like, "Oh, like hope you become an intellectual of some kind."
That has to be somewhere in your bio, Victor
Yeah. Oh,
Wu,
yeah. No.
renowned
Yes.
intellectual of some kind. We're all hoping he goes off and does well.
Yes.
I also didn't know that James Scott's signature was just a J. What a flex.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, I mean, it is, like, largely illegible. Like, if I if I didn't know,
Oh, there's more to it. It's like a J and then a dip. That's
yeah. So,
that's a guy that signs a lot of tomes.
yes. Yes.
Um,
And so the kind of sad thing is I left for so I was in the Marines from 2018 to 2022, and then I was in China doing a postgrad fellowship, the Yenqing Scholarship, in Beijing from 2022 to 2024. And I started at Yale in fall of 2024. and obviously, he's a Yale, emeritus professor. So I emailed him, was like, "Hey, like, Jim, I'm coming back. Like, would love to catch up again." And he was like, "Oh, great. Like, let's meet up." And then, he died, like, a few weeks before I started, and so this is the only time I ever met him. But
Wow.
yeah.
I mean, it's a nice example of why you should not pass up on opportunities to
Yeah.
reach out and meet, your heroes if you can. I'm a big opponent of the "Never meet your heroes" slogan.
Yes.
Um,
Yes,
so
I mean, that was, I came to Yale to work with, you know, some other intellectual heroes, or I got super interested in Ian Shapiro and Len Landamore's work, while I was in the Marines. And again, very
in the
funny,
Marines.
yeah, so I'd never read these people in college because I was doing world studies, right? So, um, but yeah, no, so I basically, the Marines was really the intellectual pivot point, where I got interested. I started the first and only political science class I took in undergrad. But I took fall 2015 as a senior for a gen ed requirement, which is the making of modern politics, the development of democracy in Europe, with Peter Hall, which actually turned out to be my favorite class of all of undergrad. But at the time, I didn't really have like the background knowledge to know how to situate it within,
Yeah.
and so but after, when I was in the Marines, I started reading a ton of IR, military history, organizational theory, like leadership and management literature. And so it got me super interested in the social sciences, and so political theory, uh, and, political science more broadly just came to be, I came to feel was, oh, that's like the natural place to do that. And then started looking around for people in political science departments who, were doing work that seemed, like amenable to my interests. And, I basically realized, oh, like Yale is the place to do that. It's kind of like realist, institutionalist, political theory, like as political science, way of doing normative theory, right? So it's not descriptive, it's not explanatory, although it involves those, but it's foundationally still thinking about, like normatively about like what is democracy and like what it ought to be.
How did your experience in the Marines affect the way you think about politics and political science?
Yeah, so it was. I mean, it's very indirect, and so it kind of, it's so I mean, one of my another thing to talk about a little bit more is, after college, I also stumbled upon Proust, and so I mean, the kind of key narrative element of there is, your a life only becomes intelligible in retrospect, right? Um, so at the time, it was just like, oh, I am and I'm a lieutenant in this unit. So I was artillery officer, so spent 9 months in, DC, like the Quantico area, 6 months training in Oklahoma, and then I was stationed in Hawaii for 3 years. Um, and so, I get to the unit, and there's just like, just like day to day practical challenges that it's very helpful to, know things about like organizational theory and sociology
Mm.
and, management, right? So as I just started, military history, IR, China, so just started reading it naturally because it's like, oh, this is obviously relevant for me. And basically the subset of that literature that I found most interesting and most lasting, basically what you call like the more theoretical wing of it. Although obviously like the practical, like how to be a manager, like, like turn the ship around, that type of, a lot of it was very practically useful. The uh, Herbert Simon's administrative behavior was this was the big one that it was a huge impact on me, in this time, and it kind of, it's a very theoretical book, right? It's an analytic, theoretical, conceptual, rigorous in the sense that analytic political or analytic philosopher would appreciate. But it's about, the real world, you could say. It's about organization. It's about institutions, and that combination just came to seem. And basically, I started reading stuff like this, and it inspired me to go back to, the real, classics like Weber,
Yeah.
and then eventually Woodrow Wilson, and people kind of in this early, like late 19th, early 20th century moment, which I think is, basically I would claim right now is the pivotal moment of, which modern democracy came into being.
Perfect chance to pivot to democracy. So let's talk a little bit about how you see, um, well, democracy. Why was that such a pivotal time?
So essentially, and this is kind of, easing into both the thoughts I had about your piece and also just the broader project and ambition more generally, right? So, I mean, essentially, like very, very sweeping story. Obviously, that you can get into the details of it, but essentially, the foundational conceptual distinction on which modern political theory and um, and institutional design of representative government, across the transatlantic world, it was based on the legislation execution distinction, and institutionalized formally, as a kind of system in which you have the assumption was legislatures legislate and executives execute. So most canonically, the conceptual distinction was theorized by Locke in the second treatise, which is your opening epigraph for the
Yeah.
the abolish the presidency piece. Um, and those conceptual distinctions, this kind of isomorphism between like the concept philosophy and the institutional design, like organizes basically political thought of representative government, from Locke through the 1850s. So the Federalists, Montesquieu, classical parliamentary theorists like Constant, Guizot, they're all working within this fundamental framework, even though they have different models within this uh, overarching theoretical apparatus. But essentially, so the story of modern democracy is, I would argue, the story of the rise of the democratic executive. And this happens in the U.S. relatively early, but it happens, across Europe, in the late 19th, early 20th centuries, you could roughly say. And the fundamental implication and the consequence of the rise of the democratic executive is the collapse of the legislation execution distinction in practice.
Right.
And so the story of this era is, political thinkers from across the political spectrum, so like people like early observers like James Bryce, Moisky Ostrogorski, Carl Schmitt, Walter Lippmann, John Dewey, Max Weber, Woodrow Wilson, most importantly for my project. They are all basically looking for ways to, like, how do we re-theorize how politics actually functions, given that we all see, that it's no longer the case that executives are merely executors of the laws. They're actually, in fact, the ones who are initiating political proposals, policy proposals, the ones who are winning political popular mandates for those proposals and pushing them through the legislature via the vehicle of the party, right? And so the first distinction that was proposed to replace legislation execution was the politics administration distinction. The most famous theorists of the politics administration are Woodrow Wilson, early Woodrow Wilson in his 1887 article, The Study of Administration, and the later Max Weber in especially his writings on bureaucracy. So the problem, though, I mean, like the politics administration distinction, and this has basically been the dialectic for 100+ years of this literature. The basic problem is that it implies wrongly that administration is not political. Right? And so that's the dichotomy that people are like, oh, like, what about this? What about that? What about so but the problem is that for legislation to genuinely move beyond a conceptual scaffolding that is inadequate, to move beyond a paradigm, right? You have to you can't just point out anomalies. You have to actually replace it with something constructive and something that is widely perceived to be better. And so essentially, my claim is that Wilson, in his mature work, did in fact come up with a better replacement. Weber, I would argue, towards the very end of his life in his work, the 1919, for example, Politics as a Vocation lecture, was in fact moving closer towards Wilson's position. And Weber and Wilson, by the way, they're sometimes put together in the administration literature, but they're often talked about very separately. But I think of them as part, and this era in general, as part of there's a transatlantic progressive movement, right? And I would call that, like, methodologically, what I would call them is the transatlantic tradition of institutional realism. And people like kind of historians like James Kloppenberg and sociologists like Lawrence Scaff have also kind of pointed out this connection. Like Kloppenberg says, basically, obviously it's a little bit simplified, but I mean, Weber is basically a progressive in all but mood. Weber's a pessimist, whereas the American progressives were relatively optimistic. But so Wilson, though, what makes Wilson so pivotal, and I would, this is a hot take, but I would, I think it's very, very defensible, and this will be one of the central, like, history of political thought claims of this project, is that Wilson was the most important political theorist of the 20th century. Certainly the most important democratic theorist. And the reason for that is so what Wilson in his mature work, the 1908 book Constitutional Government in the US, proposed to replace both the legislation execution distinction and the politics administration distinction, which is what I call, in drawing on his own words, the initiative critique distinction. So the kind of flagship theoretical claim is basically that the real logic of modern democracy, after the era, of mass democracy, of political parties, of modern kind of executive administrative apparatus, is not legislative legislation versus executive execution. It's executive initiative versus legislative critique. And so I think those foundational that's the conceptual distinction that I'm saying should replace both legislation execution and politics administration.
Okay, so I just want to make sure I follow that. Then we'll get into Wilson, the
Yeah.
theorist and the historical figure. Very unlikely pick, but I'm fascinated by the way you think, and I feel like you're going to make a fascinating case. So the legislative executive distinction that we see in law, am I right that that's sort of like the legislative is supposed to make the law? Like they determine what the law is, they pass the laws, they have the mandate from the people, and then the executive is just sort of like, the big errand boy in chief. Is that accurate, or is there more to it?
Yes. So that, in a nutshell, is what I am kind of broadly calling the legislative paradigm, as like
Okay,
a abstraction that captures both. So from Locke through Montesquieu through the Federalists through Constant, etc. Yeah. So that is the kind of organizing assumption and conceptual distinction that they're all working on.
great. Okay, and then there's the politics administration distinction, and it is the thought that like the legis. Well, actually, yeah. Can you just explain a little bit how that maps onto the legislature versus the executive, the separation of powers issue?
Yeah. So the politics administration distinction, which is arises kind of in this late 19th, early 20th century moment, was uh, basically the first attempt to replace legislation execution, and politics being a more kind of broad abstract term which encompasses both legislation and execution. And so then what used to be called execution gets kind of reconceptualized as administration. But yes, but to your earlier point, though, yes, it's exactly right. If you read the Federalist Papers, even Hamilton, who is standardly read as the premier theorist of executive power and the energetic executive, in the Federalist Papers he calls the president a chief magistrate. There's never any indication that any of the Federalists or any of the Madison, Hamilton, etc. None of them think about the president as a democratic leader. And in fact, that's precisely what they didn't want that, right? They wanted the president to be the chief magistrate because they thought that the legislature was the proper site of democratic representation, or at least the privileged site in using my quasi-technical terminology. They thought that the legislature had a privileged claim to represent the people.
Okay. And then that starts to fall apart. And so there needs to be some conceptual recognition that the executive is doing politics, not just not just overseeing things. And that's where we get the politics versus administration distinction. And then your point is that executive initiative is somehow develops over this time as an important feature in politics. And for Wilson's like the first in your reading to put this analytically front and center. Like the executive has agency, the executive can ram stuff through Congress in the US, the executive can build support. The executive might have, you tell me, equal mandate or maybe even in some cases stronger mandate from the people than the Congress. How do you think about that?
Yeah, so that I think becomes the central dialectic of genuinely modern democracy, which is the competing democratic representation claims of the executive in the legislature.
I see. So
Um,
originally there wasn't even a contest. It was just the privileged site was the legislature. And then in the 20th
yes,
century, it changes.
at least in theory, right? In practice, right? Obviously, in the U.S., the founding design was, in some fundamental senses, obsolete. Within a generation, right? But the U.S. is kind of the first early, of Andrew Jackson, right, being the kind of paradigmatic early figure. But like, so in the 19th century, Jackson and Lincoln, they're exceptions rather than the rules, right? Right. So someone just commented the logic of the three branches was destroyed by the party system. So the essence of my claim is that it was not in fact destroyed, but it was reconfigured and has to be retheorized as a different functional separation of powers, not the. So if you think that what the separation of powers is legislation versus execution, then yeah, you might think it was destroyed.
That
You
got
might you might
destroyed.
you might read Wilson as destroying or undermining the separation of powers, but I'm saying he actually fundamentally retheorized it, and I think retheorized it on more solid descriptive and normative grounds.
So let's talk about both the descriptive and normative grounds. Why do you think that descriptively what's going on is that the executive has initiative and then the legislature critiques? And then we'll go from there to the why might that be a good thing,
Yeah, so, I guess, the other thing I should say is, so
please?
even within the kind of classical legislative paradigm, it was never the case that initiative, initiative always exists, and actually the most fundamental philosophical claim of this project is that, like, conceptually, initiative, not legislation, is the first act of politics, and, like, an event of politics, initiative is the first act. So legislation really should be reconceptualized as the codification of a two-part act of initiative and critique. Um, but even within within the legislative paradigm, within classical parliamentarism, within the American founding Congress, there were bearers of initiative, and structurally speaking, due to the very familiar analytics of the collective action problem, which was kind of so Jane Mansbridge, for example, says this is like the analysis of the collective action problem in her APSA presidential address from like a decade ago. So like that analysis of the collective action problem was like an analytical advance comparable to the development of the laws of supply and demand in economics. So like I think that's a foundational to how I think about politics. And so like even within Congress is a Congress kind of famously in American politics, Congress is a they, not an it, right? And so within Congress, it's not the case that Congress qua Congress is somehow acting, right? It's individual, it's the caucus, leaders, committee chairs, especially. This is uh, Wilson's first book, which is his dissertation, written when he was like, 25 or something. It's mind blowing. He's really, really, really precocious. His first book from 1885 called Congressional Government is basically, he's operating within the legislative paradigm and he's critiquing it though. He's saying what congressional government really is committee government. It's ruled by individual committee chairs who, in back rooms, smoke-filled doors, trade favors, like suck up to party bosses, they log roll and they produce this incoherent, like special interest filled, uh, you know, like legislation, right? And so it doesn't really track any sense of popular will. There's no accountability to the people, and uh, this is happening. Wilson's writing, in the 1880s, right? But you could kind of extrapolate what he's drawing on American history from the founding up to that point. And so yeah, so it's not the case that initiative just came into being, in this era, but the argument is historically and for structural reasons which are enduring, political initiative, could say like migrated from the legislature, called legislature, to independently. Uh, sorry, I should say clarify. It migrated to executives with democratic authority, not with nationally uh, national democratic representatives who win their mandate in part via leadership of their party and enact their mandate via the party in the legislature.
Sorry, I was just distracted for a moment by the solution to replace both parties with the Jack Party and then get rid of term limits and appoint Jack as supreme leader.
Yeah,
I don't think Wilson wrote anything about that,
yeah.
but I say he has
That
no
that
objection.
that is a big if and only if true.
Okay, I've got so many questions to go on from here. I mean, one question I have for you is how do you think about Wilson as like as a figure to draw on? Because somewhat infamously, right, his reputation has gone up and down over the years, and his his quite noxious racist attitudes, I think, have caused him to take a bit of a hit reputationally, and some would argue reasonably so. But at the same time, he's this important American president and one of the big. He pushed for the League of Nations and so on. So, I mean, how do you feel about drawing inspiration from a complicated, morally gray guy like that?
Yeah, so I mean, that's part of what makes this project, what will make it kind of necessarily provocative. So I will say there is, yeah, Wilson's a very complicated figure, and I would say his reputation has dramatically declined, really only within this is a recent development. As you're saying, he got canceled in 2020. The right hates it. Like, if you read, pick any given, Claremont Review article, and it's, they'll be talking about how Woodrow Wilson was like the start of the fall of America. And more, uh, more careful, but arguments that are made by, serious scholars in this tradition, like Ronald Pistrito or Charles Kessler, and like even more moderate versions still of, people like James Caesar, um, Harvey Mansfield, Jeffrey Toulis. They all everyone recognizes that Wilson is a really pivotal figure. But so I actually also I was just pulling it up. I think there's a starting to be some pushback. So David Frum in the Atlantic back in
Hmm.
2024 published an uncanceled Woodrow Wilson piece. In which he was saying, like, for most of the 20th century, Wilson was regarded as the fourth best president, lagging behind only Abraham Lincoln, George Washington, and Franklin D. Roosevelt. And yeah, I mean, I
Oh.
think like Wilson is a really like truly distinctive figure because he was not only a political actor, he was the only president with a PhD who ever had. And also not even that, he was one of the first Americans, period, to ever receive a PhD. Yeah, and he integrates theory and practice in a way that you don't. Teddy Roosevelt was frequently mentioned as kind of the paradigmatic across the transatlantic world. So Max Weber mentioned it, James Bryce mentioned it, Alistair Gorski, like everybody was like, Teddy Roosevelt is some distinctive, the term they tended to use was plebiscitarian executive. But Wilson is the theorist, but also I would crucially say he departs from that line. So Wilson is not properly interpreted either theoretically or just historically at the level of fact as a plebiscitarian. So
Mhm.
like he in the kind of scholarship that I'm really building on, people like John Cooper or Daniel Stid, or like Wilson led via the party. He was a party leader. These people or Clinton Rossiter, they describe him as a prime ministerial president.
Hmm.
Um, and I think it's at least certainly in his first term. World War One was a kind of a different beast, but um, certainly in his first term, domestically, he led, precisely via this. He was exemplified the executive initiative versus legislative critique, uh, kind of division of labor that he himself theorized. Yeah, so the important aspects to the point about the um, issues on race and imperialism, I'd say those can't be ignored though, right? Like there's the substrate, throughout American political thought about executive power from Hamilton on. So Hamilton in the Federalist Papers openly says, we want the U.S. to be an empire. So he positively uses the word empire. Through Wilson, through arguably to the present day with Trump, etc. Like imperialism, external power, foreign power, it can't be separated. At least historically. The challenge then for this project and kind of where I'm moving beyond Wilson in a couple key ways, right? So one of which is, I'm extracting the initiative critique distinction, which I think is independent. It can readily be extracted from Wilson's
Right,
personal
right.
views from U.S. imperialism, and then I'm also generalizing, right? So Wilson is mainly writing about America. The book is literally constitutional government in the United States, and he's drawing on the transatlantic tradition. So he's drawing on British thinkers, German thinkers, American thinkers. Whereas I am, generalization is not a trivial task, right? So going from n of one to n, to potentially um, indefinite n is so that's what I see as the core of the constructive, part two of this project.
Oh man. Oh, this is super interesting. Can I just ask you how you think about executive initiative changing since Wilson's time? I mean, you're welcome to just zip ahead to the present, but if you think there were some important stops along the way, um, by all
Yeah. So
means,
um, so the I think the pivotal uh, era of history in which you get the rise of genuinely modern democracy is certainly this late 19th, early 20th century. But obviously, there a lot of things affected politics, in the U.S. and outside since then. I should also say that just to like scope and discipline the empirical um, cases. So, like in descending order of priority, basically my focus is the U.S., particularly the founding era, progressive era, and today, and then the UK, particularly the 19th and early 20th century, and then Germany, especially Imperial and Weimar. So also again, like late 19th, early 20th century, and then France, but as kind of like a contrast shadow case, in which there's a oscillation, I think, unstably, and I think I would say normatively unattractively between executive plebiscitarianism, i.e., the Napoleons, De Gaulle, etc., arguably today, um, and legislative restorationism, right? So like that's how I would interpret, say, like the French Third Republic. Um, but yeah, so those are the 4 cases, but I think the theory generalizes, but that's so like I was talking, with Chandran, Kukathis over email, a couple of days ago, and he was saying, "Oh, what about Australia?" I noticed there's a discourse in Australia about the rise of the PM and things like that, and so, I think it'll be very useful, this is exactly the direction I need to be pushed in, right? Like, I have this theoretical framework. Now, what's the, like, goodness of fit with empirical reality is the so I would say that one key thing in the US case, just to respond answer your
please.
question, just a little bit, is the rise of the primary system. So and this is a big part of James Caesar's Presidential Selection, his kind of canonical book about the American presidency and American political development and political thought. And I think rightly, generally sees the primary system, as introducing various pathologies. Although I would, um, again, Caesar, I think, wrongly reads Wilson both theoretically and historically as a plebiscitarian. Um, but he is right that I think the primary system, which was kind of it kind of developed in fragments over the course of this era. So like in the progressive era, a couple states used it. But it basically became universalized in the Democratic Party and the Republican Party. So the 1972 McGovern-Fraser Commission was kind of the pivot point in which it's like, oh, like we're going to adopt this uniformly. And so one problem with the primary system, so this is where my analysis differs from Caesar's, is I think the main problem with the primary system is not for executive selection, it's actually for legislative selection. So the key problem with the primary system, especially in one party dominant states like Massachusetts or Connecticut or California, is that it basically makes the decisive election the primary, the Democratic primary. You can generalize this to the Republican too. And the who votes in primaries, it's 5% of the electorate. It's oftentimes more ideologically extreme or insider, political insiders. And so by the time you get to the general election, the choice is already predetermined, right? And so it's not legible, because you just see, if you are like one of the 5% of people who vote in the primary, you see a ballot with like 7 Democrats. It's like, I don't know any of these people. Like, there's no reason that like a state senator, candidate should have very widespread name recognition. So you see 7 people, you have no idea who they are. You vote for one randomly. If you've like vaguely heard of them from a sign, and then that person wins a plurality, 15-20% of the vote, and then cruises to election and basically is incumbent with a safe seat. So their main challenge is being primary, right? And so that, I think, is at the level of legislative incentives and selection, is a key, possibly the key driver of why in the U.S. today we lack robust legislative critique.
The primary system specifically for Congress, you think? So
Yeah.
is it the rise of safe seats in particular? Because I mean, this is really important in the news right now, with the latest Supreme Court decision, where it looks like there could be even more safe seats coming soon.
Yes. Yes. And so certainly the ambition of this project is, you know, to So basically, all the way from the level of conceptual foundation to institutional design to like present day, 2026, 2028, 2032 reform recommendations about like what's the problem and therefore what changes would ameliorate that problem. And so, um, my partner John Griffin, who works with an organization called Partners in Democracy, founded by Daniel Allen, a Harvard political theorist.
Oh yeah,
They're
she's on
they're
Substack.
spear Yes, yes, he's on. So yes, so recently posted a. If you want to check it out, it's their Substack is called The Renovator, and so he recently, um, published a kind of like a a summary of basically the ballot campaign and like the kind of rationale for it that they're spearheading in Massachusetts right now for the ballot in November, which is it's going under the name all party primaries, but it's
Yes.
essentially yes, yes.
So someone actually asked about this in the chat. A
Oh,
capsaicin substance abuser said, on your page, you restacked this post in support of all party primaries in Massachusetts. That the abuser continued. I live in MA, and a friend of mine who's a policy leader for a progressive state level org is vehemently against this, but he's thinking we should try it out. So yeah, well, I was going to come back and ask your thoughts about this Massachusetts um, all party primary issue. So great, like please go ahead.
yeah. So essentially, this reform is a combination of two familiar electoral reforms into combined into an unprecedented electoral system. So it's top two primary elections plus fusion voting. Um,
Okay.
and so so we see fusion voting, for example, New York City has it. We see top two, for example, California has it. But
Can
they've
we
never
just
been. Yep.
can we just break each of those down real
Oh
quick?
yes, yes. So like the top two, or yeah, I just saw the the
No,
yes.
I'm moving. I'm moving. All my books are in boxes. Look at this.
Um,
I've got a whole stack with shelling and all this stuff that's on the floor. Shelling and Black Power and actually there's a book that I just got from a colleague about it's called A Fate Worse Than Hell about prisons in the Civil War. Highly recommended.
Fate.
And that's my
Uh,
attempt to unbookmark myself,
yeah.
and I don't think it worked. Please continue.
Um, yeah. So like really briefly, top two basically, it's a open, nonpartisan primary, and the top two vote getters move to the general election. So like in California, they're about to do a top two primary election right now for governor. Um, Fusion, there are kind of different varieties of fusion. So the version that Massachusetts that they're going to do is basically one in which uh, one version of fusion, which is disaggregated, is when you show up multiple times on the ballot under different party lines. So you're like Zohran Mamdani, Democrat, Zohran Mamdani, Working Family Party, etc. Um, in the Massachusetts version, all of those get put into one ballot line, so it just says, you know, um, yeah, I won't name names because that might cause some controversy. But so and so candidate, Abundance Democrat, so and so candidate, DSA Democrat, um, and so it'll say Democrat, and then right under it Abundance, and then right under it Forward Party or something like that. And so you can kind of stack. I mean, basically endorsements, right? Like endorsements from sub party organizations or potentially even organized groups. And so the essentially the because this is a theory about how this would work, right? It's based on incentive analysis, based on very credible political science, but it's extrapolating because there's no empirical data to test, because this doesn't exist yet. But the theory is that in a one party dominant state like Massachusetts, most elections will end up the top two vote getters in the primary will be Democrats, and so you'll get the general election. And then these Democrats now have a way to differentiate themselves, though. It's not just, random no-face Democrat versus random no-face Democrat. It's the abundance Democrat versus the Green Democrat, or the DSA Democrat versus the Working Families Democrat, or however you want to
Mhm.
iterate. Like, it doesn't necessarily, it doesn't need to be uniform. Like each level of government, each municipality might have different configurations. But so it makes basically the theory of party cues, right? So like when voters vote, the most like informative thing they vote based on is party label. other than like individual name recognition, they vote on party label. And so essentially, this is a now a sub party label that gets put right on the ballot, and so it gives voters it makes the differences between candidates much more legible. So going back to James Scott's term of legibility,
Mhm.
it makes the competition, electoral competition, much more legible. It makes it general because it's moving the decisive election from the primary to the general election with the broader electorate. Um, and it's a way of promoting, enforcing, improving accountability, right? And so, like, now if you're the candidate of the forward party or the candidate of the abundance, and they put, you've you've agreed to let abundance endorse you and basically put that in the ballot. Now you're tied to that programmatic commitment of what abundance stands for, right? And so it improves programmatic politics, which is standardly, seen as a good thing rather than insider, personalistic, etc. competition.
Exactly. I was just wondering about this because, like, you know, the when you have multiple candidates from the same party running in the same district, um, there's a question of how they're going to differentiate themselves. And one of the case studies that stuck with me from Shapiro and Rosenbluth's book,
Yep.
"Responsible Parties," is Japan. So in Japan, it's common to have multiple people from the same leading party running in the same district. How do they differentiate themselves? Favors, right? I mean, they have the clientelism. So there's a person that you, say, a local business or something, or a major company that does business in the area, will have a relationship with. And so, that's how you get people from the diet taken to the onsen and stuff like this. And this it's not something that I put front and center at all in my little Substack post on the presidency, but that's actually something that really does worry me about not just the president, but politics in general. But certainly in the US right now, with the executive very powerful, it's very striking how unprogrammatic our politics is. And I don't just mean that people will run on one program and then pivot and do something else, though that's also an issue. I just mean that, like, there's a lot of "I will take care of you," personalistic, clientelistic promises being made, and not even that, just improvisation by people in power. And I suppose I was trying to signal at this with the list of what I saw as corrupt pardons coming from Trump, but it's also not just limited to Trump. Um, there's the Mark Rich case for Clinton. Uh, Biden pardons his whole family, and it goes on and on and on. So I wanted to, yeah, I just wanted to underline beneath your excellent point about, like, the importance of programmatic politics. So, if just conceptually, is a way to think about this fusion voting plus top two is the thought that, like, when parties can't differentiate the candidates, there has to be some way other than the difference in person to differentiate the candidates. So let's let them run, if not exactly a party, a kind of sub-party group,
Mm.
and,
Yes.
and almost recreate party politics at that primary level.
Yeah, so it's not just at the primary level, but it's inclusive of but it's both the
Okay,
primary and the general election. Yep.
okay. So not limited to the primary level, but
Yep.
okay, got it.
But yeah, you're exactly right though. So the I would say, I mean, obviously Ian Shapiro is my chair, and and he's also the prominently displayed in your abolish the presidency piece right at the start. The
Sorry,
mysterious
Ian, if he doesn't like that piece. But
the
that story stuck with me so much. I love Ian so
yes.
much.
Yes, I mean, basically the combination of, provocative headline argument, the Locke second treatise quote, and then the picture of my advisor as the first thing. I was like, "Oh god, I have to reply to this," like, so, but, but the mysterious egg, by the way, I actually ironically, this is hearsay. I haven't actually personally asked Ian about this. I think it's an ostrich egg. I think
I
it's
also have this
essentially
belief.
yeah,
I
yeah,
don't know where it came from. There's this great philosopher, formerly at Princeton, the late Gil Harmon, who, Gil Harmon has all this wonderful stuff about managing your beliefs and so on. And, like, whereas most epistemologists are thinking, like, it's so important to have, like, airtight arguments for everything you believe. Harmon's like, stop wasting your time. Like, delete all the clutter from your mind. And so, in honor of Gil Harmon, I too believe that it's an ostrich egg,
yeah,
but I have
yeah.
deleted from my mind any possible explanation of how I got to know that information. By the way,
Uh,
we're referring to this picture. There's a picture of Ian Shapiro in this post of mine from last week, Abolish the President, later named something a little bit less offensive. Um, with Ian Shapiro, Yale political scientist, political theorist. Um, Actually, I'd love to just talk a bit more about other figures in political theory with you in a second, but it's him looking at the camera next to a apparently ostrich egg, and it's spellbinding. I I have no bird related anythings that I pose next to, but there's something powerful about it. The plumage, the eggs, anything like that, just it sends a message that like you're a bringer of life. I don't know.
Yes. I was, again, hearsay told. I really should have uh, confirmed this with Ian before this, but I was told it's a ostrich egg because his family parents were ostrich farmers in South Africa. He's from South
Oh
Africa.
wow,
Yeah.
yeah,
Um, but I'm actually just gonna pull up his page, so if anybody wants to just
great,
quickly
great.
access to this egg picture, they can take a look. But
No, this is the kind of content that you can expect in a live stream.
yes. So
High
again,
quality
on Gil
ostrich
Harman,
lore.
um, I read a bunch of Harman's papers in Salim Burker's meta ethics class back in fall 2014
Wait a minute, were we in that class together?
at Harvard.
We would have been in that class together.
Oh my god, really?
Wait, that's crazy. You were in Salim's meta ethics class in
Yeah, yeah.
2014?
It was just like, so. I mean, it's
It
both
was a
a
grad. So
blessing.
oh my god. So this is a mixed graduate undergraduate course with Salim
Yep,
Burker, who is
yep.
my pick for the greatest in terms of like firepower, greatest living philosopher.
Yes,
Oh,
that's what having drifted at this point decisively out of the philosophy world. I have not kept up, but certainly when I was an undergrad, the talk in the department was like, "Oh, who do you need to take class with?" It's like Slim Brook. That's the guy. At the time he was an associate professor. It's not even like his not he inherited Scanlon's chair, right? But
he would have been an assistant at the time. He went up for tenure
yeah,
later.
yeah. And so, Scanlon, by the way, also one of my undergrad. I graduated in spring 2016, the year he retired. So I was one of his final students. So
Okay, wait. Can we just talk a little bit about some people that we know? Because so Scanlon's interesting guys. Tim Scanlon, probably best known in America now for being the guy who wrote the book In the Good Place. So, in The Good Place, the book What We Owe to Each Other, which is an infinitely rip-offable title. I've ripped it off.
yes, yeah. What we owe to ourselves, right?
That's right. Take that, Tim. Anyway, no, but he was at Harvard for a long time. And before that at Princeton, he got this theory of ethics called contractualism, and what we owe to ourselves is kind of the like flagship statement of it. But there's also a really, really good early paper from the 70s, Contractualism and Utilitarianism, that if you're interested, I actually would recommend reading that instead if you are new to this stuff. It's so short and it's so just nonstop good. But Scanlon, what was he like to work with for somebody? Because he's like a philosopher. I mean, I think he has a background in math, if I'm not mistaken. But he's like a true ethics philosopher. A reason, he's like an analytic philosopher. Where it's like, you know, a reason is like, for X in circumstance C to phi for reasons R. It's like that level of sort of
Yeah.
abstraction. Given your proclivities and your institutionalist thinking, I mean, what was that like working with Scanlon?
Yeah. So I should say I have never given up. You say the analytic philosopher's way of thinking, right? So so the first paper in this research pipeline, which is on the Federalist Papers, is a reading of the Federalist Papers as literally a logical syllogism. And so that's the founding logic of legislative predominance, which is the conclusion of the syllogism is a descriptive assumption of legislative predominance, which we can talk about a little bit later. Just circling to this biographical point real quick. Yeah, it was like mind blowing, right? It's if you're a freshman, with a kind of background interest in philosophy, and then you get to Harvard and you find out about Rawls and Nozick, and then it's like, oh, turns out this is just like all of his best students are in the department. And you can kind of like bump into them in the hallway and take classes with them. I unfortunately never got to chance to take a class with Christine Korsgaard, but and Scanlon is kind of a weird a weird ships passing in the night. I found out about his he teaches like an upper and advanced undergrad lecture class on contemporary political philosophy, which is like Rawls, Nozick, Cohen, Susan Oken, etc. Um, so I found out about too late to take it, and then I studied abroad in Jesus College, Cambridge, for 9 months in my junior year.
Oh, cool.
I missed the next iteration of it, and so I only the first time I actually even encountered Tim was my senior year, like December 2015 or something, and it basically told him like, hey, like I never met you before, but obviously read a lot of your work, and I'm like, is really excited to take your. The last class he taught was a class on responsibility, like moral responsibility.
Yeah,
Also, actually, now that I think about it, super fitting because responsibility is a core concept of my democratic theory, as it is of Rosenbluth and Shapiro, as it is of Wilson, as it is of
sure.
Hamilton, right? So
Rosenbluth Shapiro, the book's Responsible Parties.
yeah,
Yeah.
I didn't even I literally didn't even connect that. I don't know if they're actually connected, but it's the semantic overlap is significant. But
No, I mean
yeah,
this
no,
is what you were saying earlier about Proust. Like, an intellectual life is only intelligible in retrospect.
yes.
Can I tell you a Chris Korsgaard story because you
Oh yeah,
mentioned
of
you never
course.
got to take.
Yeah,
So
I will say I did go to
go ahead.
Korsgaard's office hours once in which to talk about. I asked her what her favorite novel was, and she said Middlemarch, which is also my favorite novel in English. Again, it was
Mhm.
also yeah,
Here-
short but memorable interaction.
All right. While I'm getting bookshelf mogged, as was it MJR Schneider or somebody, maybe it was Jack said it
Okay.
earlier. Um, I couldn't help but notice he said in English. What's your favorite novel not in English? What's the language?
Um, so I don't yet know. I can't read French, although when you look at French text, so I did Latin in middle school and high school, and then I obviously am a native English speaker, and I'm learning German. I've been learning German for the past 3 years, and so you can kind of piece together like you look at a French text, and it's like I can understand vaguely like 25% of this, especially the kind of more technical terms, right? Like a lot like representation, or it's like representatif or
Yeah.
initiative, which is a used in Rousseau's initiative, or but yeah, so am I cannot read Proust in French, but Proust would be probably my favorite modern, In Search of Lost Time, would be my favorite modern non-English novel.
I says,
Um,
but you haven't read it in the original, but non-English.
no,
Yeah, yeah,
yes,
gotcha, gotcha.
I hope to, I hope to l- learn to read French at some point in the future, possibly for this project, although it depends, like
Oh,
opportunity
very cool.
costs of learning languages. The my favorite uh, pre-modern non-English novel is Romance of the Three Kingdoms. It's the kind of one of the four classic uh, like novels, books in Chinese history. Like I cannot emphasize enough how it's like I love the story. It's about basically the fall of the Han Dynasty and the Three Kingdoms period which followed it. But yeah, it's just such a it's a I like I've watched it, listened to it, like read it in translation. Other than I can't read literary Chinese yet either, but that's like a long-ish term um aspiration. But I've read
Okay.
it, yes, but yeah, so that those are probably the top three that I can think of off the top of my head right now, at least in terms of things that would be like consensus classics.
This isn't Ezra Klein. I'm not asking for your three books, Victor. Right?
Yeah.
But if anybody wants to, level up to some real literature after that, the monster at the end of this book. So I thought it would be way scarier than it was. I highly recommend it. Um, Actually, it is a pretty great book if your friends have just had new kids. It's a good gift. But okay, so that was amazing. I didn't know Chris's favorite novel was Middlemarch. Uh, you'll never believe this. I was actually Chris Korsgaard's teaching fellow for concept of the
Oh,
theory.
really? Oh,
Yeah.
oh, wow. Oh, yeah, yeah. So,
There was like a five alarm fire, like we need somebody help, and I was just ready to like go write my dissertation and stuff. I was like, what should I do? I was talking to my advisors, and they're like, I don't know, it's money, and
yeah,
I didn't have. Yeah, it was like a significant amount of money relative to my grad student stipend, and I burned it all on delicious food and drinks. But I lived like a king in Cambridge for that semester, and I have one that I loved to learn. I mean, her lectures were like paintings; they were just amazing. So Chris Korsgaard's this Kantian ethicist, author of Sources of Normativity, Creating the Kingdom of Ends. Actually, I really recommend the essays in Creating the Kingdom of Ends for anybody doing philosophy. I think they're super creative and fantastic. So, um, I love this. Early on, we were getting ready to do, my first like TA session. So it was after the lecture, and Chris is waiting for the elevator on the second floor of Emerson Hall, the philosophy department. And I have never TA'd a Kant class before. I took a class on Kant's theoretical philosophy in undergrad,
Mm,
and I read a little bit of Kantian ethics in other contexts. I read the groundwork of the metaphysics of morals, but this was going to go way beyond that. And I was joining like in week 2 or 3, so I was in midstream. And I remember um, Chris was like so eloquent in the lectures and so beautifully explaining everything. But then, sometimes things don't translate into other types of explanations. So I was like, Chris, um, do you have any advice about what I should cover for my first recitation section? She said, "It's a good question. I think you should try to cover the main ideas." And then stepped into the elevator, and the door just closes on me. And it's just I
oh
don't think
god.
it wasn't any malice. I think she did point to one idea that was worth covering, but it was just yeah, that was stuck with me. The other story that stuck with me was she really stood by me at the end of the semester when I was like, I realized, grade inflation's a big problem and so on. But I had these students that were like writing unbelievably good essays. And I was like, I don't know what to tell you. The grades just came out a bit higher than I expected. And she said, our TAs do so much work for us. I'm not gonna, um, yeah, make, I'm gonna stand by them and their judgment on this. So I appreciated that she stood by. She was actually like just fantastic, pleasure to work with, and I learned so much.
Yeah, I
Um,
was gonna so I as 2 quick response so I read, I read essays from Creating Kingdom of Ends, but I read, Sources of Normativity as a senior, fall 2015, in a grad seminar in political theory with Eric Bierbaum, my undergrad, thesis advisor, who's, very close, probably the longest standing mentor that I've had, um, and Michael Rosen, so
okay, wow, interesting.
yeah, it was an amazing seminar, it was like the ethical foundations of political thought, and so we read like, you know,
So cool.
Scanlon, Bernard Williams, and Korsgaard, et cetera. So yeah, I loved it. I was like blown away. I was like, "Oh, I can't believe this is so short." It's like 150 pages or something. I was like, "Oh my god." Yeah. So she writes beautifully. Um, the other thing which I was going to say is, again, it's mind blowing. Again, it's a blessing and a curse to have taken 8 years in between undergrad and grad school, because it means that the graduate students who were overlapped with me are associate professors, and my friends who became academics are like assistant professor at MIT, assistant professor at Harvard, assistant professor at Yale. Like, it's so yeah, so it's uh again, blessing and a curse. But yeah, so that means that you would have not only so you would have surely taught some of my friends.
That's hilarious. You don't,
Yeah.
uh, I have to mention one person who was in that class, one student in my section was Aaron Saduico.
Yeah, Aaron. Yeah, he's
You
a
know Aaron?
philosophy.
Okay,
Yeah, video game. Yes. Oh, wait. So I should also say,
please.
okay, that's okay. That makes sense now. I messaged him. I'm like, hey, like, hope you're doing well at USC. Like, just
He's a
FYI,
PhD
I'm like,
student in philosophy at USC now.
yep,
Great
yep,
philosopher.
yep, yeah. He was the year behind me at Harvard, either 1 year or two, and also did philosophy. We were great friends in undergrad. Um, And then, yeah, he's very interested in philosophy of video games, wrote a lot about it, took some time off to work on that, and then started at USC. So I messaged him recently. I was like, "Hey, like, how you doing? Hope things are going well." And I'm like doing this Substack with Danny Munin, and he was like, "Oh yeah, I love Dan." Like, I will say, just I mean, obviously we had met, briefly at PPE last year, but I didn't realize the density of overlapping connections, which now that you say that you literally TF'd at Harvard while I was there, it makes much more sense. But like, I just this past weekend was
Yeah. Um,
Bizy, Elijah.
oh,
I have good
Elijah
friends who
Parrish at Berkeley. Yeah,
yes.
amazing.
Yep.
It's amazing.
I'm, good friends with, Heidrun, one of your IHS mentee, like, yeah, it was like it's like
Well, what is this? This is like you're living in the extended Daniel
this
verse.
person
I
yes,
um
yes,
no, well,
but
so
this
yeah, just to be clear, I never actually went to an Ivy League school, but I guess I did take their Ivy money to TF for them to um no no
well,
but
and then
so
actually
yeah I have to mention, I'm just blown away by the fact that we took a class together. I didn't realize this
yeah,
um because it was like a reasonably big class, but yeah, that's fascinating.
yes. So
Um, yeah.
one of my friends who, was the same year as me yeah,
Sorry, did you see
you
Jacademic
know this guy?
Philosophy?
Like, I
Uh,
this the jacket yeah,
no, I don't know if you know this, but there were some highly credible accusations that I was a self-appointed MIT graduate.
oh,
Um, this is deep in the archives.
oh, wow, yep.
But okay, oh, please.
Yeah, yeah, sorry. Uh, so what, like one of my friends and John, my partner John's, roommate at some point, and like blockmate, Garrett Lamb was also a philosophy major or concentrator in my year. So you might have, the people I remember from that class, I remember Garrett was in it.
mm,
Yeah, so you may or may not have, been one of he
it's
was very close
not
with
familiar.
Salim, and then also Josh Green, interestingly, um, when he was at Harvard. So he kinda straddled the line between neuroscience and philosophy.
Oh,
Um,
fantastic.
yeah.
So can
Uh,
I'm realizing we've only got about 20 minutes before you got to go catch a train. So we're going to maximize value here for a little bit. Um, I, we're getting a little feel for your intellectual background, like where you came from, and can I just I want to just throw some other ideas at you and see what you think, given your, both the framework you've been developing and just your, extensive knowledge. So, Quentin in the chat asked, "What do you think about the various social choice functions, aka voting methods, like perhaps ranked choice voting and things like this, that are being constantly advocated for as a replacement for plurality systems?" So,
oh,
just as
yep.
like a little background for people, the plurality rule means whoever gets the most vote wins, even if you don't get a majority of the votes. So in a really crowded field, you can win with just a handful of, not that many percentage points of vote share. And then, but there's a lot of how do you uh, conduct a vote if you don't want plurality rule? Well, there's just like this huge smorgasbord of various options, some of which are accused of being gimmicky by people in the biz, some of which are hailed as like the democratic cure all. So yeah, what do you think about some of these?
Yeah, so Quentin, thanks for the so Quentin is a friend of mine. He's a Yale undergrad who's about to join the Marines. Just but,
Oh, what
yeah,
I feel like people have 10,000 times more stuff in common than I realized.
yeah.
Uh,
Actually, I was just
that or
one
there's
more,
some
like,
sampling bias here. I
yeah,
don't know.
one more just random, like, I've seen so James Bondarchuk, who's one of my TFs in, undergrad, is, like, sharing your stuff, and then Dan Greco, who I again, hilarious, I met Dan Greco at, Len Landemore is one of my advisors, book launch party, in February for her new book, Politics Without Politicians, and then realized Dan was all I had, your Substack, Dan Greco's Substack, Joseph Heath's Substack were my 3 favorite, like, academic philosophy ones.
Let's go.
Uh,
That's what I'm talking
and
about.
then it forms like a citation cartel, right? Like, you're all citing each other, sharing each other, like, uh, so
It's
anyway,
called
yes, I
mutual
talking
influence. It's called mutual
yeah,
influence.
yeah,
Yeah,
um,
Dan
but so
Greco,
yeah,
legend of MIT.
yeah,
There was we would play koosh where you just hit a koosh ball with a racket, and there was you know, a coat hanger hanging from a pipe on the ceiling. And the legend was that Dan Greco alone had like the aim to get the koosh ball through the hanger. And if you did, you would instantly
he did tell
get.
me this, right? I did talk with him a little bit about the, MIT philosophy, but he never
Well, this is almost certainly all apocryphal
oh
legend,
gosh.
misty stuff that appeared. after he left. But the legend was that if you get a koosh ball through the hanger, then you automatically get an A on your MA thesis. Called second year paper. Uh,
Yes, there are a lot of there's also Dan Williams, so someone just posted to get this various Substack philosophy. Yeah, there's a
he's really
there's a lot of
smart.
Dan going on in the Substack world.
That's right.
Um,
We got derailed. I think was it that you?
yeah,
Okay,
yeah, sorry,
because of
okay, yeah.
the Dan Greco and yeah, it's great. Oh no, James Bondarchuk. I have to say
Oh,
something
sorry,
about
sorry, sorry.
James.
Yeah, RCV. Okay,
Yeah,
so yeah,
can I
just
just
really,
really
just
quickly?
to answer the question that you originally posed for,
We're dying to talk over each other here.
have like,
Please go ahead. Go ahead.
oh, sorry,
I
yeah,
can save
sorry,
my
there's a little bit of
James
lag.
Bondarchuk story for later. There's just a little audio delay. It's all you.
Okay, yeah, sorry. Yeah, so just to quickly, so I don't have a strong uh position on like which specific electoral system would be optimal, other than the general, like ep- people's political and epistemic constraints matter, right? So like if you have an electoral system that you need a PhD in economics to understand, it's probably not going to be an effective one, even if in theory it would be, optimal in some social choice theoretic sense. So, and that's partly the politics of RCV, which, I mean, I think RCV in principle a great system, and like would love to see it spread more. One challenge of getting, um, you know, municipalities, states, etc., to adopt RCV is there's a perception that it's very complicated, and especially, it depends on how, there's a lot of different varieties. Whereas and this was a serious consideration when John and Danielle were, deciding which electoral reform to put on the ballot in November. Is, there's kind of a perception that it would be easier to explain, um, and you would, approximately achieve, similar desired ends if we did top two, which is very easy to explain, and then fusion. So those are very simple elements, and but put together, achieve something new and better. And I should also say, actually, just to quickly tie into the academic stuff with Ian and Francis Rosenbluth's book, I mean, the normative kind of end that they're aiming for is essentially electoral competition, which competes for the median voter, and satisfies median voter preferences, most of the time. So I agree that that's actually, that's my interpretation of this all party primaries ballot initiative as well. It incentivizes legible, general, accountable competition, which I, as a package, call responsible competition, which is also what the language that John, Danielle have been using. Um, so the difference, though, is that the Rosenbluth and Shapiro book, um, they kind of point to the past. You could say, like, there was a past in which, party elites controlled candidate selection, more than the current system. And that system had real virtues. It did enable, party leaders, long-term party leaders who have a long time horizon, do have incentives to select candidates they think will win a general election. Um,
Right. They
but
wouldn't pick
they're
somebody. They wouldn't pick a loser. And like, there's this famous case of Estes Kefauver, starting to win primaries, and the party leaders are just like, no, this guy.
Yeah,
We're
yeah,
not going with this guy. And now it's unthinkable that somebody could win the
yes,
primaries and
and so
not get selected.
that example, like that specific example, might have literally been used in the Levitsky and Ziplat How Democracies Die, or at least it's of that flavor. So the thing, though, that this reform is different than saying we should restore, you know party elite control over candidate selection. What this reform is it's building on and reforming the primary system itself. It's saying that, we're gonna have, input from the people on candidate selection, but instead of it being, uh, a 5% of, the Democratic Party, and really of that 5%, there's heavy selection bias. Um, we're gonna open it up, and so it's gonna be a general cross section of the. It's not gonna be, the whole electorate voting in a primary. That's unrealistic. But if it's 5% of the electorate, but it's a more representative cross sample voting, then that'll incentivize competition for the center more than, you know candidates who their main fear right now is being primaried from the extreme.
That sounds really interesting. I would love to see you know, it implemented, if only for the epistemic value.
Yeah.
Yeah, I
Well,
feel
right,
like
yeah, no, right, so this I mean, um, I will say also just, like, broadly speaking, I think the situation we're in right now in the US is in many ways structurally comparable to this position that the framers faced in 1787.
wait,
Like,
what do you mean?
so that there's widespread recognition that, the system is not working. The problem is though that, perception of, dissatisfaction is not a constructive solution. So you still have to, there's a coordination problem where even if everyone agrees the status quo is bad, you might not be able to coordinate on a preferred, solution. And that was precisely the situation that Madison, Hamilton, et cetera, Ben Franklin, George Washington, that was the situation they faced. So the Constitution being basically a compromise, um, like all things considered, proposal to replace the status quo. And it didn't, it wasn't. I think we should resist just as at the level of history, uh, like imagined histories where it was like, oh, this was like everyone agreed the Constitution was the best thing ever. Like, so like in New York, for example, Hamilton State, the Constitution was ratified by a 30-27 vote, and the people who opposed it were predictably basically George Clinton's cronies. So George Clinton, basically powerful, longtime governor, he opposed it because he knew it would,
Love his music.
yeah, right. So like, people oppose things and support things for political interest. This is so a lot of time, it's, uh, yeah. So it's kind of inevitable that, people who benefit from the status quo will oppose changes that change the status quo. Um,
That's
but
such a close vote. My God.
yeah, and this, this was, I think New York is the most striking and memorable for me because, Hamilton is one of like my personal heroes, I would say. Like Hamilton, Wittgenstein, and Weber, I'd say are the three my three role models in various ways. But yeah, so I mean, Hamilton basically how the Constitution passed in New York was Hamilton personally, like persuaded, lobbied, bargained, negotiated with some of George Clinton's cronies, and like basically got them to change their mind. Like, and it's literally, if it's a 3 vote differential, that means like he swayed 2 people, right? Um,
Wow.
yeah, and so yeah. Yeah, so this is politics, right? Like this is real politics, right? This is and that's the situation we're facing today. And that's also, methodologically my overall standpoint, right? Like political theory as political science, ticks, which is an empirical historical phenomenon in which you have to understand, you know, to understand politics, understand its history, understand its differences across context, country, etc., to really, I think, do good democratic.
Oh man, that is some really fascinating history. I like the comparison. And I think just like mathematically, there's certain things that people aren't good at grasping. Well, even if we are good at grasping, it takes some effort for us to grasp. Exponential growth being one, but I actually think that like aggregation and um, negation are another. Like, so it just is not true that we agree on all that much. If we all agree, we don't want this. It's just we might
Yes.
all disagree about this, but have massively conflicting preferences for all the actual concrete alternatives, one of which would need to be implemented in order for us to
Yeah.
move away from this. Um,
Yeah.
and yeah, like that I think is just a surprisingly underrated point. I mean, I'll just point out also that this afflicts a lot of like single issue polling type of arguments where I say everybody wants reform because nobody likes the status quo. It's like, well, that's you know, there's pick whatever reform you want. There's a good chance most people don't want that. You know, by the same logic that you did. So there's this analogous to what voting theorists call agenda manipulation,
Yeah.
right?
But yeah, so put more neutrally, I mean, agenda setting, right? Agenda setting is a paradigmatic example of initiative, right? So,
Oh, we're
uh,
bringing it back. We're bringing it back. Okay,
yeah.
so
So,
so
yeah. So actually,
please,
just really quickly.
by all
So
means.
I should also say one very common way that realist political theory is both presented by its advocates and criticized, uh, um, is that, oh, you're you're deflationary. You're deflating the ideals we care about. You're just saying it's unrealistic, utopian, etc. That is not what my project is. My project is fully accepting the traditional ideals of liberal democracy. So the constitutive ideals of democracy are collective agency and public accountability, and the constitutive ideals of liberalism are individual. I'm like normatively, I'm personally, I'm a center left liberal, however you want to characterize it. But I'm saying that realism as a methodology is at the level of the translation of ideals into reality via institutions. Right? So institutions are the Aristotelian form by which we collectively act. Right. Um, so institutional design matters. Institutional design is precisely where realism has its most analytical purchase and normative purchase. And so I'm saying that essentially my argument in a nutshell is that under contemporary conditions, the like descriptively, but most fundamentally, normatively best way for us to realize traditional ideals of liberal democracy is via a model of an executive initiative, uh, like and legislative critique. And precisely the core theoretical distinction that's at the heart of this is what the question, which I think is one of, if not the most important question of political theory, and certainly democratic theory today, is how do you distinguish democratic executive leadership from executive plebiscitarianism? What distinguishes FDR from Trump, or Wilson from Schmidt, right? And I think the essence of it is essentially that so both of them think that the executive makes a democratic representation claim. And in my particular language, I will say that the executive makes a general representation claim. The difference between my theory and Schmidt, and you could also say like Posner and Vermeule's Executive Unbound, being a kind of like moderate American version of it, is that the executive plebiscitarian makes a further claim, which we should reject, that the democratic executive has a privileged or exclusive representation claim. So Schmidt makes the exclusivity claim, Posner and Vermeule make the privilege claim. Whereas on my model of what a genuine liberal democracy looks like, the executive and legislature make co-equal but qualitatively distinct democratic representation claims. The executive makes a general representation claim, and the legislature makes a plural representation claim. And those are different forms of democratic representation, which are not reducible to each other, and should, in an ideal, well-functioning liberal democracy, those are co-equal claims. And the dialectic between them is precisely what defines the politics of liberal democracy. Which is also, by the way, just to tie into the Linz, which is why. So I would say, Juan Linz, like very influential, very influenced by his work, especially on the comparative politics of presidentialism, etc. But I disagree with pretty much every aspect of his argument. And so at a normative level, Linz says the problem with presidentialism is the problem of competing democratic legitimacy claims between the president and the legislature. On my model, that is the essence of liberal democracy, is the multiplication of claims to represent the people. And then just descriptively, like philosopher who is, moved into political science. Like Linz's definition of presidentialism is a cluster definition, which conflates at least 6 distinct dimensions. So, yeah. So it's like it's a strong claim, I know, but right. So Linz's definition runs together democratic legitimacy, a selection mechanism, a sanction mechanism, a removal mechanism, government formation, and a symbolic role. So, and even the best critique of Linz in the literature, which is Jose Chaibub's 2007 book, Presidentialism, Parliamentarism, Democracy, he has a much more tight definition, which is essentially, a presidential system is a system in which the government cannot be removed by the assembly. So the executive cannot be removed by the legislature. But so even that definition, though, it's problematic conceptually from the start, because actually, even in mechanism for the legislature to remove the executive, it's called impeachment. So the problem with this whole literature is, other than the analytical conflations, it's mistaking accidents for essences in the Aristotelian sense. So the essence of presidentialism, I'm claiming, is simply the independent selection of the executive. It's the selection mechanism. But independent selection need not imply that the legislature has no removal mechanism, nor need it imply that the legislature has no sanction mechanism, et cetera. Like, right? And so you could here's a thought experiment. So you could easily imagine a presidential system, still by essence presidential, in which you have a unicameral legislature that can impeach the executive by simple majority vote at will. And so is the president is still selected independently from the legislature, but can be removed by the legislature. There's nothing inherent about presidentialism as such which makes that impossible. And that actually sounds quite similar to what when people say parliamentarism, which again, I think parliamentarism is a bad concept. The more apt term is prime ministerialism under modern conditions. The distinction between presidentialism and prime ministerialism is essentially at the level of the selection mechanism and then also the formal possibility of divided government, which is a real concern, right? So if you think divided government is like this all things considered super terrible thing, then yeah, maybe you don't like presidentialism. But that's a very different argument than what Linz is putting forth and what this literature puts forth.
Amazing. That was just such a great way to encapsulate your thinking on this. I'm so grateful that you came on and talked with us about your work and your background. This was awesome. I wanted to ask two last questions, and we've got 3 minutes, so feel free to make them just like that. One, Ben Conroy in the chat asks, could you say a little more about the difference between the plural and general claims on your view? So you said that the legislature has like a plural claim to legitimacy, whereas the executive, it's like collective. Is that right?
So it's plural representation claim. So this is also building on literature in the last 20 years on representation theory in Democrat. So people like Lisa Deesh, Nadia Urbanati, Mark Warren, Andrew Rayfield, Jane Mansbridge. So yeah, essentially, and I'm deliberately using the terms general and plural because I'm kind of appropriating Rousseau's general will, Dahl pluralism, etc. Right. But yeah, I mean, the claims themselves are actually quite familiar. It's the claim that the president is the only elected official that represents the whole country, that speaks for the whole country, that makes a claim about the direction that the country as a whole should go in. Whereas the legislature, in its ideal, is a plural body. It's a plural it ought to be a plural diverse body representing, various facets of society, geographically, socially, politically, culturally, etc. Right. So like what makes a good legislature is precisely this feature. And this is what, so Alain, in her work, she's really building on this. And she's saying that essentially, if that's what we care about in a legislature, then actually the election is a terrible mechanism by which to, or I shouldn't say terrible because then it sounds like I'm. Her argument is that it's a bad mechanism. But so that the argument then is if we think that, then therefore we need to switch to sortition as a selection mechanism for legislatures to achieve descriptive representation. This is the mirror theory of representation is what's kind of like been called in the literature by people like Eric Nelson in his very, very fascinating book, The Royalist Revolution. So anyways, so that's in a nutshell. The argument, the difference I'm saying is that those are co-equal, although qualitatively distinct representation claims that the executive and legislature make, and that dialectic, that dynamic between them, is the defining feature of modern liberal democracy.
Crushed it. Last question. Is there an academic paper or book that you'd recommend, or just that you love?
Yes. So I will pull a couple. This is your version of the Ezra Klein 3 book.
That's right. That's right.
Okay. So like I literally think this is the most important single work of 20th century political theory. Constitutional Government in the United States, Woodrow Wilson, 1908. I won't recommend Wittgenstein's Investigations because I think your audience is very familiar with that. So I've cheated and choose the fourth. So the second one is E. Schatzlander's Party Government. so this is basically the theoretical predecessor of Rosenbluth and Shapiro. They're building on this. I think Schatzmatter is seeing, he's a kind of a canonical figure in American political development, and I think he's seeing there's a real revival of interest in his work in democratic theory. The last one, again, this would be oh shit, I shouldn't have ended with this, but
It's all
uh,
good.
yeah. So Carl Schmitt's Essence of Parliamentary Democracy, like the proximate cause for basically this like entire synthesis to come about was reading this book over the Yale spring break in March of this year. Like, cannot emphasize enough. I read it. It's so concise. It's so impactfully written. The prose is amazing, and it's just so incisive. Like he's making basically when I read this book, I realized like, oh shit, this is like the second edition of this was written in 1920, published in 1926, exactly 100 years ago. And he's making like, pretty much the exact same argument that I was kind of inchoately trying to grasp towards. And not only that, was with the one difference, the same diagnosis, different normative conclusion. That's the key difference. But
Oh.
the other thing is the thing that really crystallized it is he was citing all of the same people who I found the most fascinating across the entire history of political thought. And so, he was citing Woodrow Wilson, Walter Lippmann, Public Opinion, the Federalists, Gaetano Mosca, Bagehot, Mill,
Mm,
has everything like almost like in a flash. It was okay. I know what I want to say. So yeah.
that was everybody. Make your spring break 2027 plans now. Get a copy of one of these books. Victor, thank you so much. Please don't miss your train. I really appreciate you.
Okay. Yes. Thanks so much. This was an incredible opportunity. Thanks. I
And
look forward to seeing you at PP
I'll
in
see.
November.
I'll see you at the PP Society. Shout out James Bonderchuk. I'll tell your story some other time. Bye.
Yeah.